Thank you very much, Mr Deputy Speaker. I've requested this debate this afternoon to put right a wrong which has been done to a long-established business in my constituency, but also to highlight wider issues about government procurement policy, particularly in relation to the National Health Service. The government rightly talks about delivering a Brexit which supports UK businesses, jobs and our standard of living. This sorry story illustrates how even before Brexit, we're unable to create a level playing field for our companies, let alone back them. And in this case, the EU cannot be blamed for the lack of transparency, fair competition, or the exclusion of a UK company from an NHS preferred supplier list. Under NHS Procure 22, the Department of Health appointed Keir as a Tier 1 provider to decide who should be the preferred providers for floor covering to NHS facilities. In May 2018, without any competitive tendering or other transparent process, it was announced that 3 overseas companies would be on the preferred supplier list. 2 French companies, Tarkett and Gerflor, and a Swiss company, Forbo. Halstead's, a UK PLC in my constituency, with a 50-year track record of supplying NHS institutions, was not on the list, or even given the opportunity to tender or participate in a dialogue with Keir. They are a highly successful global business that we're proud of in Radcliffe, with a global turnover of £250 million and a UK turnover of £83 million. The NHS currently accounts for approximately 15% of the United Kingdom turnover. A significant proportion of this is now at risk, in addition to the potential reputational damage of being excluded from the list for unstated reasons. Many NHS organisations asking Halstead, understandably, why are they not on this list? This would be bad enough, Mr Deputy Speaker, in any circumstances, but it's made worse by the recent track record of the 3 overseas companies. In October 2017, these 3 companies were found guilty of price fixing over a 23-year period in France, to the extent that the French Competition Authority fined them a total of £302 million. They were found to have discussed minimum prices, price increases, sales policy and other sensitive information, such as their trading volumes. Secondly, the French regulatory authorities discovered they'd exchanged confidential, recent and detailed information on their sales volumes and commercial forecasts. This information was exchanged through the FEC, which is the sectoral trade union in France, which was in charge of collecting the information and sharing it with manufacturers. It is surprising, some would say staggering, Minister, that 7 months later these same companies were given a monopoly as preferred suppliers by the National Health Service. In addition to this, it's worth noting that Tarkett pay no UK taxes whatsoever. To be clear, they aren't breaking any laws in doing so, but that doesn't mean there aren't ethical and fairness issues which follow. I have a number of specific questions that I'd be grateful if the Minister could answer, or if he's unable to do so today, if he could write to me in detail, I would be very grateful. What criteria did Keir use to draw up their preferred supplier list? In the absence of competitive tendering, what process did they use? Why was Halstead's and other suppliers not included on the list, or even given the opportunity to put their case? What consideration was given to the probity of the 3 overseas companies in view of the sanctions imposed on them in France? Will the Minister assure me, and this is incredibly important, that Keir will be instructed to add Halstead's to this list as a matter of urgency, and for that matter any other company that appropriately belongs on this list? Will the Minister initiate a review of all such NHS contractor lists with a view to identifying how many are drawn up without a competitive tendering or transparent process? I believe this case has wider implications for UK government procurement policy and NHS procurement policy than simply this matter affecting the business in my constituency. My final question is, will the Minister issue an instruction in due course that NHS staff and third parties, such as Tier 1 providers, appointed on the NHS's behalf to commission goods and services have a duty to be proactive in encouraging UK companies to apply or bid depending on the relevant process. And I want to make it very clear at this point, this is not a question of saying that in a way which would be unlawful, the National Health Service or the government should favour UK companies over overseas companies. That's not the case in these circumstances whatsoever. So if officials try and deflect from the substantive issues here, that's not the issue. The issue here is that a UK company that clearly, with its track record, with its financial probity record, with the quality of its goods and services, should be on this list. A company that's never been sanctioned by any regulatory authority. And in contrast, we have these 3 overseas companies who, less than a year prior to this decision being taken by the NHS, were sanctioned in a very, very significant way for price fixing, basically operating a cartel in France over a 23-year period. Now, Minister, this is either a question of incompetence by those charged with these responsibilities. Clearly, this is not a direct ministerial responsibility. Having been a health minister, I wouldn't hold the minister personally responsible for procurement and tendering individual decisions. But ministers are responsible for policy in these areas and for oversight. And there is either a question here, Minister, of incompetence or, frankly, something stinks in terms of the decision-making process that Keir has undertaken in this case. So I'd be incredibly grateful if the Minister would respond to the substantive points that I've made today, look at the wider implications in terms of UK government and NHS procurement, but very specifically put right as a matter of urgency the wrong that has been done to Halstead PLC in my constituency.
Mr Deputy Speaker, it's a pleasure to answer this debate this afternoon. I thank the honourable gentleman for calling this debate to highlight an issue that he feels quite rightly very strongly about as it affects a company in his constituency. The title of the debate, I think, highlights the 2 things he wants to talk about. One is the specific issues, and maybe he will allow me, perhaps Mr Deputy Speaker, given the House has some time, I will be able to talk a little bit about the procurement processes with subcontractors in general as well. The debate, as we've just heard from the honourable gentleman, highlighted an issue with a specific framework contract, which is, as he rightly says, overall managed by the NHS and by my department. The contract is managed by the department. The specific issue he is raising is around the use of subcontractors in the flooring industry under the Construction Framework Procure 22. And this issue was originally raised through the Government Public Procurement Review Service, hosted by the Cabinet Office, as you will know, back in December last year. He asked a question, a response was provided by officials at the time and is on the government website. However, Mr Deputy Speaker, the honourable gentleman has asked a number of very direct questions, and I want to tackle those, I hope, later in my speech, and I hope they'll satisfy him. If not, I will, of course, be very happy to write to him. The issue that the honourable gentleman is referring to is that one of the suppliers on that P22 framework is using 3 companies based within the European Union, and a supplier in my honourable friend's constituency is not being used. And as he rightly said, it's not, he is not seeking to suggest that suppliers can be excluded for lawful reasons. What he's suggesting is that I think that the supplier in his own constituency has been excluded because there wasn't fair competition. And I think that was at the essence of what the honourable gentleman was saying. He will know that in response to the competition question, my department and the Cabinet Office did provide a response which says that whilst we have some influence over subcontractors used on the Procure 22 framework, this only relates to certain Tier 1 subcontractors which are primary supply chain members. The primary supply chain members are required to pass a certain series of checks with the authority before they can be registered. These checks are limited to organisations undertaking certain roles and does not extend to the suppliers of flooring products. The principal supply chain partners have been selected through an appropriate procurement process in line with the public procurement regulations. These companies are then free to build their own supply chains, and this is where I think the Honourable Gentleman's company from his constituency is at odds, that they have built a supply chain and that they're not always, the companies leading that supply chain are not always bound by public sector procurement regulations. I am obviously aware of the issue that he refers to in terms of the French authorities imposing a fine at the end of 2017 on 3 of the companies, and I will want to come on, I think, directly address some of the remarks he made about that in a moment. Officials within my department have met with supply chain partners on a regular basis, and we do seek, wherever possible, to encourage and make sure that the use of UK-based SME subcontractors are used. We also, of course, as the Honourable Gentleman rightly says, we have a duty to the public sector to ensure that we deliver value for money, and it is for our supply chain partners to demonstrate this on each of the products. The Honourable Gentleman, I think, is concerned that my department has not replied to a letter from Halstead's, which are the aggrieved company in question, and that letter was in January this year. I can confirm that the department received the letter from DWF lawyers acting on Halstead's behalf. It was addressed to me on the 16th of January. My department has a record of a reply being sent on the 13th of February, and this referred DWF to the response that had all been published on the Public Procurement Review Service, which I referred to earlier. However, if the Honourable Gentleman has not got a copy of that reply, or indeed when he speaks to Halstead's they have not got a copy of the reply, or their lawyers have not passed it on, I will be happy to do that. I can also say that officials at my department have now engaged with Halstead's directly, and that engagement started in March 2018. And that was obviously to explain how the framework operated, and I hope they will be able to confirm to the Honourable Gentleman that officials have responded to fairly promptly to any questions that have been raised. I understand that they have used this feedback and that they're currently bidding to form part of the supply chain. The Honourable Gentleman asked a large number of very specific questions, and, Mr. Speaker, given that the House has a little bit of time tonight, I thought I might try and directly respond to those now, rather than writing directly to the Honourable Gentleman.
Would the Minister give way?
I'd be delighted to give way.
I'm grateful, thank you. I take an interest in this because I have a large and very successful district hospital in my constituency of North Devon, and I listened with care to what the Honourable Gentleman opposite said. It seems to me that what we want in public procurement, not just in the NHS but across the public service, is to have the best contractor do the best job at the best price for the public purse, whilst all the time, as the Honourable Gentleman very wisely said, doing so in a framework of fair competition. I'm interested, does the Minister believe that the fact, if it hasn't happened in this case, is that a structural problem with the P22 framework, or is there a local difficulty that is to blame here?
Minister. So, my honourable friend is right, and I wanted to speak a little bit more about the overall process later in my speech and remarks. I am aware, having been to Nottingham to open the National Procurement Centre for the NHS last week, clear, as he says, that we should ensure that we have the best procurement processes in place so that we make sure that the public purse is spent wisely, and even more so than almost any other part of the public sector in the health service, because money spent wisely is better patient care, and that is clear at key. I hope that I'm going to be able to prove to my honourable friend and the honourable gentleman in a moment that the problem with this contract was not the framework itself, but was actually more to do with how one particular company chose to apply that criteria, I'm not saying that they actually necessarily applied that criteria inaccurately or wrongly, but that actually would not be in a way that we would normally encourage. The honourable gentleman, yeah.
Thanks for the frankness of your response and openness so far. The last comment was very telling, really, because the Minister acknowledged that perhaps in these circumstances Keir had not behaved in accordance either with best practice or what would usually be expected, even if they didn't do anything unlawful. And what I want clarity, if possible, Minister, on is whether the Minister or his officials will be or have had strong words with Keir about what this situation has exposed and the unfairness that's been applied to, in this case, the company in my constituency, whether he has or whether his officials have had, or whether they will in the future have that conversation with Keir in terms of what is expected of them going forward.
I mean, just to be clear, and I'll be absolutely clear about this, I was not suggesting that Keir had not necessarily followed best practice. They certainly had not acted unlawfully. What I was suggesting is that, clearly, as I said a moment ago, that we would hope that we would encourage all of the people using the frameworks to ensure that there are opportunities for UK firms to be on those frameworks. So let me try and directly answer some of his questions. He asked what criteria did Keir use to draw up the supplier list. It's not, as I explained in terms of how the framework is set up, the department is not what we do is to make sure that the principal supplier on the framework then is there correctly, appropriately and legally, and then it is not for the department to comment on the criteria which private sector organisations use to draw up their supplier list. The department sets out the expectation of the principal supply chain partners, and our expectation on them is to ensure that supply chains provide value for money, quality services to the public sector. And therefore, understandably, because of the very nature of what is being procured, I can confirm that each supply chain partner will have its own processes and pre-qualification criteria. He also said, he asked me directly, in the absence of competitive tendering, what processes did they use? Again, it is not for the department to comment directly on the specific processes, but I can confirm that each of the supply chain partners needs to follow its own internal policies, and those policies and procedures must align with the requirements of the framework. I do not have... He asked directly also about why Halstead's and other suppliers not included on the list were necessarily given the opportunity to put their case. I think that they were potentially given the department does not have visibility of which suppliers and the whole list of which were given an opportunity to put their case. However, again, Halstead, I know, are now discussing that with the supply chain partners because, as I said, Halstead my department has spoken to my department's officials, and that's gone back as far as March 2018. I understand now that they're using that feedback. They're bidding to form part of the supply chain, and the application will be considered. We will give the undertaking that the application will be considered fairly and scored against the criteria set. The honourable gentleman also asked me directly, I think, about what consideration was given to the probity of the 3 overseas companies, given that there were sanctions imposed upon them in France. I'll give way again.
Sorry, Minister, this is very quickly. Will be tested against the set criteria, but the Minister can't tell me what that criteria is. Is that a fair reflection of the situation?
Minister. Well, what I can tell you is that, as I've said earlier in my remarks, that each what we do is that each principal supply chain partner must make sure that their internal policies and procedures align with the requirements of the framework, but it is not for the department to tell each principal supply partner how they set out their criteria, nor the specific processes they use. However, what I am giving the honourable gentleman reassurance, because he did make, I think, quite rightly the point that it is my department's responsibility to ensure that the policy is correct, and what I hope he's hearing is that my department ensures that there are the right procedures and processes in place, and that the individual principal supply chain partner must choose the most appropriate one for the right framework that they're on. And I hope he'll accept that. I was just about to refer to the issue of the three overseas companies that were chosen and the sanctions that were imposed upon them. As I said earlier, Mr. Deputy Speaker, I'm aware that the French authorities imposed a fine at the end of 2017 on the three companies being used. What I would say is that those convictions were imposed after the preferred supplier lists were established, and the department clearly does not have the visibility of the contractual agreements between the supply chain partners and their suppliers. The supply chain partners are not within the scope of the Public Contract Regulations 2015. He asked whether or not I could assure him, the Honourable Gentleman asked whether I could absolutely assure him that the Keir will be instructed to add Halsteads to their list as a matter of urgency. He will know, obviously, that it is not within my remit or my ability to instruct private sector organisations to engage with specific companies. But what I can reassure him is that Halsteads are currently bidding as part of the refresh of the Keir supplier list, and their application, as I learn it, will be scored on the merit of the criteria set. So I hope that reassures the honourable gentleman. I want to turn briefly, I think, Mr. Deputy Speaker, to how the department supports and encourages small and medium-sized enterprises and subcontractors more generally. Clearly, we have been dealing with some very specific issues, and I think that underlines the complexity of the procurement landscape. The understanding of who exactly subcontractors are and the work they undertake is, by its very nature, not well understood, unless it's for a very major, significant construction project. NHS organisations would usually expect the Crown Commercial Service or the Regional Procurement Solution to identify and track the supply chain of suppliers providing the goods, works or services. However, there is currently a limited understanding as to the suppliers on locally negotiated contracts. The Public Contract Regulations 2015 clearly allow public sector organisations to permit subcontracting within supply chains, so long as subcontractors meet the minimum standards set out, and we've just the honourable gentleman will know that I've just set those out in my remarks. Where there are issues with the subcontractor's performance, the regulations also allow for the subcontractor to be excluded. The Department SME Action Plan for 2019-20 highlights actions we are taking to make it more easy for small and medium-sized enterprises to work with the whole of the health system. And we have, as a department, a target to ensure that we spend 23% of our direct spend and 23% of our direct and indirect spend with small and medium-sized companies by the end of March 2022. And I will give way.
Notwithstanding the note the Minister might just have been passed. But this is an important point. I've mentioned already the fine hospital I have in my constituency, but I also have many fine SMEs who need to be on a level playing field when it comes to be able to tender for these sorts of procurement contracts. And I think what I'm looking for the Minister to give me, and I'm sure other honourable members with other fine SMEs in their constituencies, is an assurance that they have that level playing field and that they can get these contracts.
I am happy to give my honourable friend that assurance, because it is absolutely the commitment of the government to ensure that small and medium-sized enterprises are not excluded from any form of public sector procurement. And I am pleased to say that in our department we've published an action plan to that effect. I am actually the Minister in charge of ensuring that action plan is implemented, and I am pleased to say that the Cabinet Office hold meetings of ministerial champions across Whitehall to make sure that we as a government meet our targets. I'll give way one last time, yes.
Thank you, Minister. Thank you very much. Can I ask the Minister, this is a really important point of clarification. Are Keir or similar organisations fulfilling their function required to publish the basis on which they make these decisions? So the Minister has said that it's not for the department to tell them how to fulfil their responsibilities in terms of drawing up these lists. But are those organisations required to publish openly and transparently the basis on which they make decisions about their preferred suppliers?
Minister. Well, what I can say to the honourable gentleman, and he's heard me say it twice, and I'm happy to have a longer discussion with him outside this debate, is that there is a process in place where principal supply chain partners are on the framework. If they are on that framework, then they have to make sure that their policies, procedures and the criteria they intend to use align with that framework. They, as a private sector organisation which has been contracted by the public sector, then have subcontractors to them. They have to ensure that the processes that they use, therefore to contract those subcontractors, are compliant with the framework. And I'm happy to set that out in writing for the honourable gentleman if you'd like to see. Clearly, the department cannot and does not instruct those principal supply partners to detail every aspect, but we have to be reassured, as I've said to him before, that the processes and procedures they use will be compliant with what we've set out in the framework. And I'm happy to put that down in a letter to him. Mr. Deputy Speaker, I think this has been a fascinating debate, because actually it gets to the heart of what we want to do. If you want to have a vibrant economy, then there must be transparency in how companies are able to contract for public sector contracts and the supply thereof. And what the honourable gentleman has rightly done on behalf of his constituents is to make sure that we are clear as a department, and we have investigated as a department that the processes and procedures being used were the correct ones, and to ensure that if, as he believes, his constituents were unfairly treated, that we as a department look at that. And I'm pleased to say to him, as I said earlier on, that my officials have been in regular contact since 2018 with Halsteads, and I am now pleased that they're able to refresh their application, I think, for the subcontract list. I'm also pleased, Mr. Deputy Speaker, to have had the chance briefly to have set out the government's overall ambitions to ensure that all small, medium-sized enterprises are able to bid for government contracts.